Well, thank you for coming. And first I want to start off with a short analysis of Peter Cameron's technical briefing. You know, he's in a tough spot. Over the last several bargaining sessions, it's become quite clear to us that he doesn't have a mandate to make any big moves. And so the only thing he can do is point the finger at someone else. He's not been empowered by Christy Clark or Peter Fassbender to actually make the big decisions that will help bring the parties together. Just look at the Premier's 10-year scheme. It's been 15 months since she first mentioned it, and it's still on the bargaining table. Teachers have told this government time and time again that 10 years is not realistic and it's not reasonable. But it's still on the table. You know, I do agree with Peter Cameron on one thing. It's time to make big moves. Teachers don't want to escalate our job action. What we want is a fair and reasonable deal negotiated at the bargaining table. But the government is the one that controls the funding. They need to empower Peter Cameron and BCPC to actually bring some new resources, new funding to that table, or a deal will be difficult. The stumbling blocks are obvious. The government needs to back off the 10-year term. They need to offer a fair wage increase. Right now, there are two zeros on the table. At 1% increase that is not retroactive, meaning a zero for the 2013-14 school year, and another zero in 2015. It's unfair and unreasonable considering what other workers have received. And the government also needs to start taking the BC Supreme Court decision seriously. They are working very hard to ignore the courts and keep our working conditions out of the collective agreement. Students in BC need smaller class sizes, more support for children with special needs, and extra help from specialist teachers. British Columbia currently funds education to the tune of $1,000 less per student than the national average. We're seeing the results of these right across BC school districts right now, and you've seen the headlines. Many of our school districts are planning brutal cuts that could see the loss of hundreds of teachers and support workers losing their jobs. That means more larger classes for our students and less one-on-one time. And that's just not acceptable. Already in BC, there are more than 16,000 classes with 4 or more children with special needs. There are 3,800 classes with 7 or more children with special needs. That means those children and many others are not getting the support that they need. And it's time for the BC Liberals to reinvest in our education system. And yes, it will be expensive because the system has been underfunded for so long. 12 years of cuts. Teachers work hard every day to give our kids the best education possible, and they deserve to be treated fairly. It's time for government to do something meaningful at the bargaining table and to provide a fair deal for teachers and better supports for our students and more one-on-one time. Thank you.
Jim, when is stage 2 of the bargaining going to start?
Well, for us, what we want is a negotiated deal, and we're encouraging government to come to the table and actually bring the funding that it will take to get that deal. For us, it's about negotiating a deal. It's not about escalating our job action. So we will be monitoring the bargaining situation closely, and then we'll take a look at it and we'll make a decision when we need to make a decision. There's no timelines right now. What we want is a deal at the table, not escalated strike action.
How do you respond to comparisons to other unions who have settled with government for much less?
Well, actually, when we look at the settlements out there in both the public sector and the private sector, what we think that what we've put on the table in asking for 3% in each year over 3 years in a cost of living is in keeping with what we've seen in other sectors.
You said Peter Cameron doesn't have the power to bring in more resources. Can you elaborate a little bit more on his limitation?
Well, that's our sense when we're at the bargaining table. We agree that there needs to be some big moves, but we think that that move needs to come from the employer, from government. And we don't believe that he's been empowered to do that. We've seen that a number of times at the bargaining table where we've been waiting, and they've had to wait before they get an approval even to put the wage offer they put on the table, which we saw is very unreasonable, unfair, and actually not in keeping with some of the offers that were negotiated previously with others.
So do you think Peter Cameron has done whatever he could have done already?
Well, you'll have to ask him that question. Well, what we're looking for is a reasonable deal negotiated at the table. And what we want to do is bargain at the table. We need government to bring the resources to that table. They need to deal with class size for our students. So come September, we get smaller class sizes in place and we have more specialist teachers hired. And yes, we need to deal with a fair and reasonable wage offer. And what we need is government to bring to the table something that we see as fair and reasonable. They haven't even brought to the table what other public sector, some of the public sector agreed to, that government gave them the 2 and 2. They haven't brought that to the table for us. And so it's time that government at least bring to the table in the first 2 years of whatever length of agreement what they settled with some of the other public sector workers across this province. And they seem to refuse to do that. They seem to be treating us differently, and we don't understand why.
Do you buy the idea that the credit rating, if the government is going to pay out that's what BCTF demand?
Well, you know, that's, I found that humorous when they made that comment, because it's actually a scare tactic that they're trying to use, that we would be responsible for the credit rating in this province. This government, in the last budget, which is a flatline budget for education, which is very unfortunate and will continue leading to the underfunding and more cuts that you see right now that boards are going to have to make. But they brought in a budget where they've projected contingencies and surpluses over the next 3 years. And the minister stated that the reason why they have these contingencies and surpluses, which I think amount to over $1 billion, is to deal with some of the labor issues, negotiations that are going out there. So they've actually put money away. And you know, it's about priorities with this government. We know that they spent, I think, $600 million on a retractable roof for BC Place that hardly ever retracts. I mean, it's a beautiful roof. They just settled with California Power for $750 million rather than going back to court. And the Minister Bennett said that's a good deal for British Columbians, that they give California Power $750 million. But yet it's not good for our students to see smaller class sizes and have access to more specialist teachers next year. You know, I think our students are much more important than California Power. I think that would be a good deal if they put that money into our schools, our public education system for our students, and for a fair deal for teachers and better supports for our students.
So if the negotiations will escalate to stage 2 at some point, worse comes to worse, what will stage 2 look like?
Well, you know, like I said, I'm hoping we don't get to stage 2. That's not what this bargain is about. This bargain is about getting a deal at the bargaining table that's good for teachers and good for students. Stage 2, if we ever end up having to go to stage 2, will be rotational strikes. And what that means is that there will be one school closure in every district per week. So instruction would take place 4 days a week, and schools will be closed on 1 day a week. But let's hope it doesn't get there. Let's get government to bring the necessary funding so we can get that deal.
The minister just had a speech at the BCSTA, and he said that he is willing to talk about class size and class composition, and any suggestion that say he doesn't care is wrong. So what's your take on that?
Well, you know, we had a huge Supreme Court decision in January where government, again, for the second time, was found to violate the law of the land, violate our constitutional rights. In 2011, the Supreme Court found that what they did in 2002 in taking smaller class sizes out for our students, which are our working conditions, taking out class composition guarantees, and taking out minimum levels of learning assistance teachers, special education resource teachers, teacher counselors, teacher librarians, all the collective agreement. What they did was illegal and wrong. And that was confirmed again in 2003, January, just recent January. And the Supreme Court asked government to restore those provisions back in our collective agreement for our teachers and for our students. And what did government do? Within 2 weeks of that decision, government put on the table wanting to strip those provisions out from our collective agreement again. And that's just not acceptable. They want the status quo. And we know what the status quo means. Highest class sizes across Canada, according to Stats Canada, the least amount of teachers working with students, 16,000 classes with 4 or more students with special needs in them, $1,000 less per student than the Canadian average in funding, the loss of 3,500 teachers, 1,400 specialist teachers since 2002. And look what's happening right now. Coquitlam announcing 35 to 38 teacher librarian positions will be eliminated. If we had those minimum levels back in our collective agreement, that wouldn't be happening. So if they really cared, they would put those supports back into the collective agreement so our students and our teachers would have those protections.
Is there any settlement song that you can budget in, or you think that Education Minister can budget?
Sorry,
The settlement song, that they are little bit better, you say the settlement song, whereas BCTF is not. So is there any middle ground that both parties could budget?
Well, about bargaining, bargaining is about compromise. I've said that at the bargaining table many times. It's about compromise, but it's about moving forward and not backwards. And we want that deal. And there will have to be moves made at the table. But government has to bring the funding to the table. You know, in 2006, government wanted a deal, and they actually brought to the table the necessary funding. We saw what happened in 2011, according to the Supreme Court decision. The government did not bargain with us in good faith. They wanted to provoke us into a full-scale strike to turn public opinion against us. And we were at the table in good faith trying to get a deal that we now know was impossible because of government strategy. So we're back at the table now because government legislated a 2-year agreement with us, and we want that deal. But we need them to come to the table, make some moves on important issues, which they know, and one of them being huge on class size and minimum levels of specialist teachers, what the court asked them to restore. So we will compromise. We will not move backwards. We will move forwards. We want that deal, and we want it sooner rather than later.
The BC Government Services Employees Union found savings in their contracts by leaving positions unfilled. Is that something that the teachers union will consider?
Well, you have to look at what government did in 2002 when they stripped our collective agreements. As a result of their actions, which were illegal, twice now by the Supreme Court of the land, people expect government to uphold the law, not to break the law. That's what we expect in our democracy. And as a result, we lost 3,500 teachers that work with students, some in classrooms and some as specialist teachers when they work one-on-one. That was taken out of our collective agreement. This government has taken a lot out of our collective agreement. And they want more, and that's just not acceptable. Okay. Thank you.